So in the last video, we set up a label and we set up a picker view. Let's go ahead and run it one more time to see what happens. Run it here. And you'll notice that when UnitConverter opens up, I get the label, but the picker view is unpopulated with information. There's nothing there. So in this lesson, we're going to start solving that issue. Let me go ahead and stop this. But before we can do that, we need to talk about picker views and data sources and delegates. Let me go back here. Now let's talk about picker views. So you saw this kind of picker view, which had by default the names of some California cities in it. So a picker view is just another type of view. We've been working with views when we're creating our apps. But picker views need a little bit more information in order to get them to do their job. For example, a picker view has to know how many rows it should display and what format those items should look like, and then what to do when you click on an item. So we have to find some way to get all that information to the picker view. So the first thing we need to do is provide a data source. And a data source is going to say, well, how many sections and items do I have? And that information then gets returned to the picker view. So if our data source says that we have one section and 5 items, we have one section, also called a component, and we have 5 items in that one component. And again, a picker view can have multiple components in it. So that's the data source. The delegate says, well, what should I display, and then what should happen when an item gets clicked or selected. So how do I display those 5 items, and then what happens when an item actually gets selected? The delegate handles those selection responsibilities. So in order to do that, we have to implement what are called protocols. And protocols means that any class can take on the role of a delegate, or can be a data source, but it has to implement the methods that the picker view in this case needs. And so in order to be a data source, it has to implement number of components in picker view and picker view number of rows in component. So a data source has to implement these two methods or you'll get an error. To be a delegate, you'll have to do title for row for component and did select row. So you can kind of see by these method names, this is going to be how many sections or components, how many rows, and then what's the title for each row, so what's going to be in each row, and then what happens when you select each row. So those are picker views in a nutshell. So let's go ahead and go back to Xcode and start to implement some of that information. So we need to first give our picker view a data source. Okay, so in order to do that, I am going to hold the control key down, click on my picker view, and you see I have data source and delegate. So I'm going to drag from the data source to view controller, which is going to set this view controller as the data source for my picker view. And you can see it says view controller. Okay, so now I've selected a data source. Let's go ahead and run. Oops, let me close this. Let's go ahead and run that app, see what happens. And it opens up, and you can see it immediately crashes. And if we look up at the error down here in the console window, it says unrecognized selector. And the reason is it's expecting those methods that we talked about in the presentation, and it didn't see them. So if it didn't see those methods, it's going to throw an error. We have to actually implement those in our view controller. So let's go ahead and do a couple of things in our view controller. So we need to, first of all, right now, view controller implements UI view controller. So we'll also need to implement the UIPickerViewDataSource protocol. So now it's going to force us, we get an error here, say it does not conform, which means we have not yet implemented those methods. So we are going to go ahead and implement those two methods. Remember, it was number of components in picker view. So we'll do that one first. So it was function, number of components in picker view, and it takes a UI picker view and it returns an integer. So in this case, we're going to return 1, which means our picker view is going to have 1 component. And then we're going to do picker view, number of rows in component. So we're going to implement this method. Again, it takes number of rows, returns an integer. We're going to return 10. So we're going to have our picker view is going to have 10 rows. So let's go ahead now and run this. And what's going to happen is the picker view itself is going to call those methods in order to figure out how many components and how many rows it needs to have. So the picker view is actually calling those. So there we go. We've got question marks because we haven't said what data is going to be in there yet, but you can see I can scroll through it and I should have 10 rows in my 1 component. Just for the heck of it, let's go ahead and change these values. Let's put in 3 components and we'll just put 5 rows, or 5 rows in each, just to show that we can change that. Let's go ahead and run that, see what that looks like. Now you can see I have 3 individual components, all with 5 rows. So you can make some very customized picker views. So what we've done, we've made our UI view controller a data source. We've implemented the UIPickerViewDataSource protocol. In order to do that, we had to add these 2 methods. I'm going to put this back to 1 and 10 for right now, but we're going to change that. And now we need to be able to put some actual data into our picker view, and we'll do that next.